Music 292, Week 9, Part 1, Phrase Deviations Definitions. Hello, class! So in this video, I'm going to talk about what to do when phrases go wrong. And I'm joking a little bit with that, but essentially what I'm going to talk about in this video is this idea that we can hear certain kinds of phrases as having irregular phrase lengths. We talked last week about some of the standard phrase lengths and some of the standard phrase models. But this week is really going to focus on the exceptions to those patterns and what to do in those situations. We're going to use the term phrase deviations to talk about those times when things don't fit the expected lengths. A phrase deviation is therefore a modification to the expected phrase length. Just a reminder from last week, we typically expect phrases to be 4 bars, 8 bars, 16, or 32 bars long, or other powers of 2. So when I mean powers of 2, I mean like 2 to the power of 1, 2 to the power of 6, and so forth. But these are basically doubling each time. When phrases don't conform to these lengths, they're going to sound too long or too short. It's really all about what our mental expectation is of the music in this particular case. So I'm going to give you essentially a toolbox for working through those situations when it's too long and too short. We're going to talk about 4 types of deviations in this unit. 2 of them are going to be about extra content that we're not expecting in the phrase, and 2 of them are going to be about content missing that we might expect in a phrase. Our extra content deviations are the extension, which by the way is by far the most common type of deviation. An extension is added content, which might look like an extra phrase segment, but it's not one of the original phrase segments of your model. An expansion, which is much less common than extension, is a situation where added content stretches out a phrase segment. So a segment looks longer than what it should be. On the other side, for missing content, we have a compression, which is the deletion of an expected phrase segment. And we have contraction, which is the idea that a phrase segment is shorter length than what we expect. It's essentially squished. So we're going to take a look at a few diagrams that map these out a little more clearly. First, let's take a look at extensions. Extensions we can essentially think of as added content, sometimes looking like new segments. So for example, if you have a phrase where you went and you identified your basic idea, you did the breakdown of how to locate each one of the segments, and you came up with something that looks like what I have on screen, well, we have too many segments for this to be a phrase model. It looks like it should be a sentence, BI, frag, credential idea. But we have many more frags than what we expect. So those extra frags are extra content to our phrase. They're going to sound like something out of the ordinary. They're essentially extra stuff. We're not just going to ignore extra stuff in terms of formal organization of phrases. We need to label that in some kind of way to show the people that we're communicating with that this is indeed extra stuff. And for extensions, there are 3 types of extension labels possible, depending on the position relative to the cadence. If it comes before the cadence begins, it's called a pre-cadential extension. If it happens after the cadence begins, but before the cadence concludes, it's going to be a mid-cadential extension. And if it happens after the cadence concludes, it's going to be called a post-cadential extension. In this example that we're looking at on screen, the extra stuff happens before the cadence even begins. So because of that, we're going to call this a pre-cadential extension. This is the way that we're going to label it. We're going to use vertical brackets, and we're going to put the words pre-cadential extension inside those brackets. We don't need to show segments inside of those brackets. Those segments aren't really part of the phrase model. That's just a way that we were helping ourselves to understand the content when we were working through our analysis. When we deal with extensions, it should look like we can literally take scissors and cut out that extension to generate what is a normal phrase model or a normal phrase length. All right, let's take a look at another example. Say, for example, you had a phrase where you marked out your basic idea, you marked out repetitions of that, fragmentations, and other content, and you ended up with something that looked somewhat like this. Once again, we have way too many segments to make up a normal phrase organization. And once again, the kinds of segments we have here suggest that this thing's probably a sentence. So we need to decide, well, what are we going to count as the extra content here? Things like harmony or cadence might come into play in this situation to help us make those decisions. So in my hypothetical phrase here, I'm saying that, well, I've got a deceptive cadence happening at the end of the first potential cadential idea, but I have a PAC at the ending of the final possible cadential idea. In this case, the deceptive cadence is not going to be strong enough to end a phrase. Deceptive cadences are an example of evaded cadence, a new concept that we're going to break down in this video. Basically, the cadence is set up, but it doesn't realize the way that we want it to. The PAC, on the other hand, is a very strong cadence, and as such is going to function as a phrase-ending cadence. So in terms of what the extra stuff is, well, we recognize in the deceptive cadence after the 5 moves to something that is not 1, that something so-called wrong has happened in terms of our overall phrase expectations. And then at the ending, at the moment where the 5 moves to 1, we're realizing the so-called proper cadence, the way that we want the cadence to happen. So essentially all the stuff after the original 5 and before the concluding 1 chord, all of that we're going to hear as extra. Because this happens after a cadence initiates, but before a cadence concludes, we're going to call this thing mid-cadential extension. Mid-cadential extensions are always associated with some form of deceptive or evaded cadence. All right, let's take a look at one more example. Say, for example, we had something that was very clearly a sentence, but then we had some related content kept going after the ending, after we've achieved a cadence and achieved the phrase ending that matches that cadence. Say, for example, we had some things that suggested that this wasn't a new phrase yet. So for example, maybe it's the same fragment we had earlier in the phrase that keeps on going. That's a really common way of seeing it. Or for example, maybe we haven't had a solid break to indicate that we have new content afterwards. Or maybe no contrast, maybe some other factors that are suggesting we're not into the new stuff yet. So once again, we'll think of that as extra stuff, extra segments. And because it happens after the cadence has concluded, we're going to call this thing post-cadential extension. So I will once again reinforce, extensions are the most common kind of phrase deviation that you're going to see in your music. And it will be important to understand how these 3 types break down. We're going to talk about this in more detail when we get to the analysis video. All right, next I want to talk about expansions. This is the idea of stretching out a segment larger than what we would expect it. And this concept is really about proportions that we expect within phrase models. So you might remember when we talked about the sentence phrase model, we talked about the fact that whatever length is set in your first basic idea, we expect that length to come back in our second basic idea. We expect the fragmentation to be half of that length and happen twice. And then we expect our cadential idea to return to that original length. So if I have a 2-bar basic idea, I expect it to be 2 bars, another 2 bars of basic idea, frag for 1 bar, frag for 1 bar, and cadential idea for 2 bars, like I've got on the diagram. In an expansion, though, we would see a distortion to those proportions. So say, for example, that you had a 2-bar basic idea, but then your next basic idea for some reason was longer. And we didn't have a reason to think that it was some sort of pre-cadential extension. There was nothing separating it out into like a 2 + 1 bar, for example, but rather it was a continuous 3 bars. Then in that case, we would call this thing an expansion. We're expanding the expected proportion. It doesn't change the phrase model. You notice you still have all the components for the sentence form. It just changes the expected proportions. And the way that we're going to label that is simply to write on top of it expansion and then tell the reader, well, what is different than what our expectation is? In this particular case, our BI is 3 bars long rather than 2. Contraction is basically the opposite of this. So rather than stretching out a segment, a contraction takes a segment and squishes it smaller than expected. So going back to our same sentence model here, where we expect 2 + 2 + 1 + 1 + 2. In some situations, we might see a basic idea that's only 1 bar long instead of 2 bars long. We could theoretically call this a fragmentation. A lot of it will be dependent on context that we see in the piece. But in some cases, there might be reasons to not hear this as fragmentation. And in that situation, we're going to call this thing a contraction. To label that, we're going to write the word contraction and then indicate what's wrong with it. The basic idea is 1 bar rather than 2. And then finally, compressions occur when a segment is missing entirely from the expected phrase model. So once again, referring to our sentence form, we typically expect BI, BI, frag, frag, cadential idea. But if we had one of our fragmentations missing, for example, this would be an example of a compression. It's not just that something has been shrunk down, it's that an expected segment just isn't there. And once again, we're going to label it by essentially drawing an arrow or some other kind of label to the location where we expect the content, identify it as a compression, and then tell us what's missing. We're missing the expected second frag here. I will mention there's a little bit of ambiguity in applying this in analysis, because if too much stuff is missing, you can't always reduce it down to one possible phrase model. So in some cases, you might just have to choose what you think is the best option and then use that as your reference model for indicating compressions. Those are your definitions for the 4 different phrase deviations. In our next video, we're going to take these 4 and we're going to apply them to actual samples of classical music. You're going to notice that it's a lot more gray area probably than what you're used to dealing with last year, and that really is the main focus of Music 292 and 293. So thanks for watching your definitions. I'll see you in the next video.